The first scream cut through the terminal with the sharpness of breaking glass. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to freeze in their humming. At the center of the commotion, a young airport supervisor jabbed a trembling finger at an older man standing near the security checkpoint, her voice cracking as she shouted that he needed to be escorted away immediately. Passengers drifted back in alarm, forming a widening circle around them. It looked in those first few seconds like a threat had just been discovered. Yet the man at the center of the storm stood perfectly still, his hands clasped politely in front of him, his posture calm as snowfall. That man was Dr. Jonathan Hale, 63 years old, steel grey hair, weathered knuckles, the kind of face people trusted enough to ask for directions. He wore a tan wool coat that had seen too many winters and carried a leather briefcase older than most of the travelers around him. He did not look dangerous. He looked tired. He looked like someone simply trying to get home before the roads iced over. But in the eyes of the young supervisor, fear had turned into something closer to indignation. She stepped forward again, voice rising with an authority she didn't quite know how to wield. The accusation hung in the air, thin and fragile, yet powerful enough to bend the mood of the terminal. "Sir, I asked you to step aside. Now." Jonathan lifted his gaze toward her. His expression didn't change, but something in the way he inhaled a slow, deliberate breath hinted at a weight pressing behind his ribs. The moment stretched too long, choked with tension, until the supervisor's radio crackled with static. She nearly jumped. 2 security officers approached, boots pounding like punctuation on the polished tile. The taller one, Officer Ray Donovan, moved with the impatience of a man who believed he'd seen everything. The other officer, Linda Cole, kept her hand hovering near her utility belt, not out of aggression, but worry that her partner might escalate too quickly. Donovan planted himself in front of Jonathan Broad's shoulders, blocking half the walkway. "So you were told to step out of the line." "Why didn't you comply?" Jonathan answered in a voice so gentle it clashed with the chaos around him. "I did comply. I simply asked her to explain why." The supervisor stepped between them. Flushed with embarrassment, she tried to mask as authority. He questioned protocol. He refused to follow instructions. But she didn't finish. Her voice cracked again. Jonathan looked at the officers, not the supervisor. His eyes held a clarity that startled Officer Cole. Not defiance, not guilt. Something else. Something steady. Something that did not belong to a man intimidated by airport security. "I would like to know," Jonathan said quietly, "what justification there is for removing me when I have done nothing but stand where I was instructed." Donovan scoffed. "No justification needed." She gave an order. "You're in a federal checkpoint. You question an order, you lose your place in line." That simple. His tone, clipped superior dismissive, stirred murmurs from passengers nearby. A few older travelers exchanged glances, their brows creasing with unease. There was something wrong here, something off balance in the way power shifted so quickly toward force. Cole cleared her throat. "Maybe we should talk somewhere more private." But Donovan didn't budge. He loomed closer, crowding Jonathan's space. "Sir, step out now, or what?" The words didn't come from Jonathan. They came from an elderly woman watching from a mobility chair near the stanchions. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with outrage. "He's twice your age. He's not resisting." "Are you all out of your minds?" Passengers turned. Pressure built. The terminal climate changed, the air tightening. Donovan ignored her. So last warning. Jonathan's pulse thudded, once heavy in his ears. He wasn't angry, not yet, but inside his chest something shifted, a familiar tightening he had spent years training himself to manage. He had lived a lifetime in rooms where the wrong reaction could alter the safety of millions. He had witnessed arrogance destroy careers, destroy families, destroy lives, and he knew the danger of people who confused authority with expertise. Officer Donovan Jonathan said, using the man's name with deliberate respect, "I have no intention of causing trouble, but I will not be removed without being told why." That did it. Donovan's jaw clenched. He grabbed Jonathan's elbow, not aggressively, but firmly enough to send a message. The crowd inhaled as one. Cole stepped forward in alarm. "Ray, hold on. Let's slow down." Jonathan's balance wavered. He caught himself on the railing, breath hitching. Pain shot across his shoulder. Old pain, the kind that came from a life he did not talk about. Not in airports. Not with strangers. The supervisor paled. She hadn't meant for it to get physical. She took a step back, guilt flickering in her eyes. I thought he was—" "What?" Cole asked sharply. "What exactly did you think he was?" The young woman swallowed. She couldn't answer. Not without exposing the truth that she had acted not on training, not on threat detection, but on instinct shaped by bias and stress. Donovan didn't give her time. "We're clearing him. End of discussion." Jonathan straightened slowly, the slight tremor in his arm unnoticed by everyone except Cole. And in that moment, in the quiet between heartbeats, something inside her shifted. She studied Jonathan, the steadiness of his eyes, the patience in his breath, the absence of fear. She recognized something she hadn't expected. Respect. "Sir," she said softly, "let me look at your credentials." Jonathan hesitated. A small hesitation. Barely a breath, but enough for her to sense that whatever he carried was not ordinary identification. Then he reached into his coat. A ripple of tension passed through the crowd, human reflex, collective fear at the unknown. But Jonathan moved slowly, deliberately producing a black leather wallet with no visible markings. He opened it, revealing an identification card with a federal seal unlike any Cole had ever seen. Her face drained of color. Donovan leaned over her shoulder. "What is that supposed to?" Cole's hand shot out, stopping him. "Ray, stop." Her voice carried a gravity that froze even the supervisor, because now she understood who they were touching, who they had mishandled, who they were seconds away from humiliating in front of 200 witnesses. The name printed on the card tightened her throat. Dr. Jonathan Hale, Chairman, National Transportation Oversight Council Authority, under congressional mandate. She looked up at him. He met her gaze not with triumph, not with anger, but something much heavier. Disappointment. Officer Cole swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm so sorry." Jonathan closed the wallet. His voice was low, steady, absolutely controlled. "I would like to know what led to this." The supervisor's knees weakened. Donovan's breath faltered. The watching crowd pressed closer, sensing the shift, sensing the storm they had not expected. And Jonathan Hale, the man they had judged as harmless, as ordinary, as disposable, stood silently beneath the fluorescent lights waiting. The rising tempo had only begun. The silence around Jonathan thickened after his identification card closed in his hand, the air shifting as if the entire terminal had exhaled at once. Officer Cole stood frozen, her palms damp, her breathing shallow. She had never seen that seal, except in briefings she assumed would never touch her real life. She tried to form words to apologize again, but Jonathan's eyes, steady, quiet, unbearably calm, held her in place. Behind her, Officer Donovan's jaw worked back and forth, as if he were grinding down the pieces of his own confusion. He didn't understand. Not yet. But unease had rooted itself under his skin. The crowd pressed inward, without stepping closer, a ring of widening awareness. People leaned forward, with the instinctive hunger of witnesses, sensing that something important was unfolding, something larger than a man asked to step aside. Jonathan breathed once, slow and deep. The weight of the moment settled into his shoulders, heavy but familiar. He had spent decades sitting across from senators who underestimated him, governors who dismissed him, executives who mistook his silence for weakness. But never had the misjudgment occurred so publicly, nor so personally. He could feel the tremor in his right hand, beginning a reminder from the old injury he carried quietly, a story only his late wife ever knew in full. He curled his fingers subtly to steady the shake. Officer Donovan tried to recover his footing, stepping forward with a forced confidence that rang hollow. "Sir, there must be a misunderstanding. If you'd just come with us to sort this out privately." Number Jonathan's voice was quiet, but it dropped through the space like a weight. He did not raise it. He didn't need to. The firmness in his tone cut clean through Donovan's attempt to regain control. "I will not be moved again without reason. And I will not be spoken to as though I have disrupted your checkpoint when I have followed instructions precisely." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. An older man in a denim jacket nodded once, slowly, as if witnessing a truth settling into place. A young mother held her child closer, the tension in her shoulders easing as she realized the older gentleman was not the threat the supervisor had claimed. Officer Cole shifted her weight, stepping slightly in front of Donovan, not enough to provoke him, but enough to signal restraint. "Dr. Hale, please understand. The supervisor filed what she perceived as a safety concern. We have to respond. It's procedure." "Procedure is not a shield for poor judgment," Jonathan said softly. "Procedure requires discernment and respect." His gaze moved briefly to the young supervisor, who flinched as though his words carried a sting. They didn't. They carried truth. The supervisor's throat bobbed. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but shame closed it again. Her eyes darted toward the security cameras hanging overhead, suddenly aware of her own reflection through the lens of accountability. Jonathan turned back to Cole. "In all of this, you have been the only one who attempted to de-escalate. I appreciate that." Her breath shook without her permission. "Thank you, sir." But the moment was interrupted by the arrival of another figure, cutting briskly through the ring of passengers, a man in a navy suit tie, askew the edge of an ID badge swinging against his hip. His nameplate read, Anthony McCready, and he carried the restless energy of mid-level authority, attempting to mask high-level panic. "What's going on here?" McCready demanded out of breath. "We received a notification of a halted checkpoint lane due to an uncooperative traveler." He stopped cold when Jonathan met his eyes. Recognition came slowly, like dawn pushing up over a horizon. First confusion, then recollection, then a jarring realization that flushed the color from McCready's face. Dr. Hale Jonathan inclined his head. "Good God, McCready," whispered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Sir, I had no idea you were scheduled to travel through today. If we'd been informed, we would have ensured proper clearance, That will not be necessary," Jonathan replied. "I did not come to announce myself. I came to travel as any citizen would." Donovan blinked his voice, cracking slightly. "You know him." Macready let out a humorless laugh. "Son, the people who know him usually answer questions in front of Congress." Another wave moved through the crowd, an audible shift, like wind stirring through corn stalks. A few onlookers straightened, suddenly aware they were witnessing something rare, the unmasking of a man whose influence reached into corners of the nation most never thought about. Macready stepped forward, hands clasped, posture dipped in apology. "Sir, if any of our personnel treated you improperly, I assure you we will handle the matter internally." Jonathan studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. The man's sincerity was visible, panic-driven, yes, but genuine beneath it. "Before anyone is handled," Jonathan said quietly, "I want to understand what led to this." The supervisor shrank into herself. Donovan stiffened. Cole lowered her eyes. Silence spread thick and suffocating. Jonathan turned first to the young supervisor. She looked no older than his late daughter would have been now. Nervous hands, eyes clouded with fear she did not yet know how to articulate. "Tell me," he said gently, "what did you believe you saw?" Her voice cracked. "I thought you skipped the instruction to step to the side, and when you questioned me, I thought you were resisting. It's been a rough day, and we're understaffed, and You thought I was resisting because I asked a question." Her face burned red. "I didn't mean Cole stepped in," her voice, low but firm. "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't violate protocol. He didn't refuse a directive. He just asked why he was being pulled aside. That's all." And Ray, she cast Donovan a look that carried months of unspoken frustration escalated too quickly. Donovan bristled. "I was following the chain of command." "No," Jonathan said, his tone soft and sharp at once. "You were following your assumptions, and those assumptions nearly led you to lay hands on a man who complied with every instruction given." Donovan's mouth tightened, but his eyes flickered with something like doubt. Or fear. Jonathan looked at Macready. "I expect accountability. Not punishment for the sake of appearances. Not scapegoating. Accountability rooted in understanding and improvement. Nothing more, nothing less." Macready nodded, eager, relieved for direction. "Of course, sir." "Absolutely." Jonathan lifted his briefcase, adjusting his grip with a quiet wince he hoped no one noticed. An echo of pain radiated down his arm, an old fracture that surfaced whenever stress settled into his bones. "I would like to continue to my gate now," he said. Of course," Macready repeated, motioning for Cole to escort him, as if she were guarding a cabinet-level official. But Jonathan paused before taking a single step. His gaze slipped to the supervisor again, her shoulders caving inward under the weight of her mistake, and something softened in his expression. "Young lady," he said, drawing her eyes up, "you must learn to distinguish urgency from fear. One protects people, the other endangers them." Her breath caught. I'm sorry." Jonathan nodded once. "May we both hope the lesson stays with you." He turned then, walking with the steady dignity of a man who understood both the fragility and the necessity of authority. Officer Cole followed at a respectful distance. The crowd parted in reverent silence. Behind him, Donovan exhaled shakily, as if he had just stepped away from the edge of something irreversible. The supervisor blinked back tears, and Macready pressed his palms to his temples, whispering a prayer that the fallout would not reach Washington before he filed a report. Jonathan did not look back. He had no need to. The storm he carried within him was already shifting, stirring again, warning him that the day's turbulence was only beginning. The jet bridge groaned under the weight of boarding passengers as Jonathan approached his gate, moving with the careful, measured pace of a man who refused to show fatigue, even as it pressed against his ribs. Officer Cole stopped before the entrance, recognizing that whatever happened inside the aircraft was beyond her authority. She offered a quiet nod, one that carried respect and apology wrapped into a single breath. Jonathan returned the nod and stepped past her without a word. Inside the cabin, warm air hummed from overhead vents. Passengers shuffled in the narrow aisle, jostling coats and carry-ons, trading weary smiles and impatient sighs. The scent of peppermint from someone's holiday drink mixed with the smell of damp wool, forming a strangely comforting cloud of humanity. Jonathan paused, letting the crowd surge around him, like a river parting around a stone. He had always liked this moment before, a flight, the raw honesty of people suspended between destinations, stripped of pretense, reduced to their most human forms. But today something felt off. A tension threaded through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable, like the distant vibration of an engine misaligned. A flight attendant approached with a polished smile that dimmed when she registered his expression. "Good afternoon, sir. Are you needing any help finding your seat?" Not help, he thought. Just space to breathe. But he merely lifted his boarding pass. She scanned it. "Seat 14. C. Right this way." He followed her down the aisle. Halfway back, a commotion simmered near his row. Two men argued quietly, not loud enough to draw attention from the front of the cabin, but intense enough that nearby passengers stiffened. The younger man seated at the window bristled with defensive tension. The older man standing in the aisle radiated the cold authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Gentlemen, let's resolve this quickly. We're still boarding." The older man didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the younger one. "You're in my son's seat." The younger man's jaw tightened. "No, sir, I'm not." He lifted his boarding pass with a trembling hand. 14A. Window, 14 Ors. A belongs to my son. The older man produced his phone instead of a boarding pass, thrusting the screen forward. "And I'm not asking again. Move." Jonathan felt the air shift, fear, defensiveness, shame all colliding in the narrow aisle. The father's voice carried entitlement, the kind forged through years of expecting the world to bend when he spoke. The young man in the window seat shrank his breath shallow, his eyes flicking between the furious father and the child, peeking anxiously over the seat in front of him. Jonathan recognized the look in the boy's eyes, the fear of witnessing an adult lose control, unsure how far the fall would go. The flight attendant stepped in, firmer this time. "Sir, we need to see your boarding passes, not your phone. We can resolve," the older man snapped. "I'm not showing credentials to someone half my age with a badge from a budget airline." His words weren't shouted, yet they cut through the cabin with surgical sharpness. Several passengers turned. One woman whispered to her husband. A college student pulled out her phone but hesitated to record. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "Sir, FAA regulation requires..." The man's eyes flared. "FAA regulation requires you to do your job. My son is not sitting in a middle seat because some kid printed the wrong ticket." The boy shrank deeper into his hoodie, mortified. Jonathan felt the familiar ache at the base of his throat, the ache of watching grown men brandish authority they did not earn. He stepped forward, not imposing, simply present. "If I may," he said. The father swung around, ready to attack with the same venom he used on the attendant, until he registered Jonathan's expression. Not angry, not afraid, just unbearably steady. "This is not about seats," Jonathan continued. "It's about dignity, and right now yours is slipping." A hush fell. Passengers who had ignored the earlier argument now tuned in, drawn by something in Jonathan's voice, something low, instructive, almost judicial. The father stiffened. "Who are you to insert yourself?" Jonathan didn't blink. "Someone who has spent far too many years watching grown men teach their children the wrong lessons." The boy lowered his eyes, shame spreading across his small face. The father sputtered, searching for footing. "This kid is in my son's seat." End of story. "Then show your boarding pass," Jonathan said gently. "If you are correct, the solution is simple. If you are mistaken, then the apology belongs to you." The man's throat bobbed. He looked down at his phone. Then, reluctantly, he dug into his coat pocket. The paper pass emerged with a quiet crackle. The flight attendant leaned in. Her voice softened, almost sympathetic. "Sir, this says row 15. "Not 14. The man froze. Color drained from his face in waves. His son peeked again from the seat ahead, eyes wide, watching his father grapple with something larger than a seating error, the collapse of arrogance. The father stepped back, the full reality settling on him. "I must have misread it." The young man at the window swallowed hard, still pressed against the armrest, as though expecting impact. "It's okay, sir." "Really?" Jonathan touched the seat back lightly, drawing the father's attention. "Children don't learn from our perfection. They learn from how we carry our mistakes." The father closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were softer, dimmer, human. He turned to the young man he had berated moments earlier. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." The young man nodded, shoulders easing. "Thank you." The father stepped aside, guiding his son toward row 15. Before sitting, the boy glanced at Jonathan, with something like gratitude flickering behind uncertainty. Jonathan inclined his head, a small, silent reassurance, and returned to his own row. The flight attendant approached her smile, faint but warm. "Thank you for diffusing that." "I didn't diffuse anything," Jonathan said quietly. "I only reframed it." Passengers slowly resumed settling in. Coats shoved overhead, books reopened, murmured conversations resumed. But an undercurrent remained, a mix of curiosity and unease. People who had witnessed Jonathan's calm strength leaned into their aisle space, whispering theories about who he might be. He ignored the attention. He slid into seat 14C with a soft exhale, the briefcase placed carefully beneath the seat ahead. His fingers traced the worn leather handle grounding him. But just as the cabin began to steady, a voice cut sharply through the hum. So the flight attendant crouched beside him again. "There's someone who wishes to speak with you." She looked uneasy. "She says it's urgent." Jonathan lifted his gaze. "Who?" She swallowed. "A woman claiming to be from the State Transportation Board. She boarded last minute. She said she's been trying to find you for weeks." A cold thread wound down Jonathan's spine. "May I ask her name?" The attendant hesitated, then whispered it. "Elaine Mercer." Jonathan's breath paused mid-chest. His fingers tightened around the leather handle. He had not heard that name in almost 10 years. And the last time he did it had been in a sealed hearing room where careers ended and a whistleblower vanished like smoke. The drone of passengers faded. The hum of the cabin withdrew into silence. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. thin drifting flakes settling like ash on the tarmac. Jonathan straightened slowly. Send her in. She appeared in the aisle like a shadow, stepping out of a forgotten memory, her presence cutting clean through the noise of passengers settling into their seats. Elaine Mercer stood taller than he remembered her posture, stiff, her expression carved with the kind of restraint that suggested years of silence weighted heavier than any spoken truth. Her navy coat was dusted with snow, melting into darkened patches across the wool, and her gloves, thin leather worn at the fingertips, twisted in her hands, as though she couldn't quite stop them from trembling. Jonathan felt the old pulse of dread tap once at the base of his spine. Not fear, not any more, but recognition. The kind that comes only when a ghost you hoped was buried manages to find your gate number. Elaine stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "May I sit?" Passengers shifted uneasily around them, sensing tension without knowing its shape. Jonathan gestured to the aisle seat beside him. She lowered herself slowly, as though unsure whether the chair would hold. "You look well," she said, though the words were brittle. "You look tired," he replied. A flicker crossed her face, pain, annoyance, something darker, but it vanished beneath practiced composure. For several breaths they sat in silence, the cabin lights fading into the soft gold of boarding mode. The hum of overhead vents wrapped around them a quiet veil over their unspoken history. Then Elaine leaned in. Her voice dipped so low it barely existed. "I didn't come here to talk about the past. At least not all of it." Jonathan kept his gaze forward. "Then why are you here?" "Because you're in danger." A thread of ice wound through his chest. The words were not dramatic. She didn't have the voice for theatrics, but urgent raw pulled straight from the bone. Danger from whom? She closed her eyes, briefly gathering strength. The council. The same people who buried your report 5 years ago. Jonathan's pulse thudded once. He said nothing. Elaine continued, her breath unsteady. "You think you're safe because they appointed you chairman. You think they elevated you to silence you. But Jonathan, they didn't silence you. They set you up." He turned to face her fully now. His expression didn't shift, but his eyes sharpened, the soft grey tightening into a blade. "Explain." She swallowed hard. 2 men boarded this flight under fabricated credentials. They're not airline staff. They're not TSA. They're here to get to you before the oversight hearing next month. Your travel itinerary was leaked. You're not supposed to make it to Washington. Jonathan's heart didn't race. It deepened, settling lower, heavier, like a stone descending into dark water. His voice remained quiet. "And you know this how? Because I helped leak it." The words hit him with the precision of a hammer striking iron. Passengers around them continued stowing bags, adjusting seatbelts, laughing softly, the oblivious soundtrack of a world unaware it sat inches from a fracture line. Jonathan's fingers curled around the armrest. Why her eyes shone with a grief so old it had turned into something colder. "You don't understand. They forced my hand. After the investigation fell apart, after you left the council, they told me if I didn't cooperate, they'd reopen the case against my brother." Jonathan remembered. A name. A young analyst who had unearthed something he shouldn't have. A career cut short. A disappearance into paperwork and subcommittees. Dead by his own hand, the report had claimed. "Your brother is gone," Jonathan said quietly. Elaine nodded, trembling. "But the council doesn't care about truth. Only leverage." Jonathan's breath tightened. "What did they want you to leak?" Everything. She looked him in the eye. Your schedule, your route, your seat number. The fact that you would be traveling alone. Jonathan inhaled slowly, deeply anchoring himself. He spoke with the quiet precision of a man who had spent too many hours in sealed hearings, measuring the weight of each word. Then why warn me now? Because I saw who boarded. Her voice cracked. And because they won't stop at you. If this plane goes down, they can blame mechanical failure. They can erase the trail. You know too much, Jonathan. You always did. His mind measured the implications swiftly. He had been preparing for the upcoming hearing for months, spent compiling evidence of systemic failures, political corruption, federal negligence. Enough to collapse more than one agency. Enough to cost powerful people their empires. And now he understood the tension he had felt earlier, the misalignment, the wrongness vibrating beneath the ordinary. He shifted in his seat, scanning the cabin with the slow, practiced subtlety of a man who had once been trained to read entire committee rooms with a single glance. Two men stood out immediately, one seated near the emergency exit, one near the front galley. Both too still. Both watching too much. Both wrong. Jonathan felt the old injury in his shoulder throb a pulse from another life, reminding him how quickly calm could fracture. Elaine whispered, "They'll act once the cabin door closes." He tightened his grip on his briefcase. Inside, it lay documents that could alter national policy evidence no one expected him to carry physically. Evidence worth killing for. "You came to warn me," he said. "But what do you expect me to do? We're on a crowded aircraft." She shook her head. "I don't know. I don't even know if I made things worse by coming. But if you don't do something before we leave the ground," he finished the sentence for her, "they'll do it for me." A chime sounded overhead. Flight attendants moved to secure the cabin. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, warm and unaware. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are closing the cabin door. Prepare for departure." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He looked at Elaine, at her trembling hands, at the guilt deepening in her eyes. He looked at the passengers, oblivious, innocent. He looked toward the two men watching him from across the plane. Then he leaned back slowly, exhaling a breath that misted faintly in the cold air from the vent. "Elaine, tell me exactly what they fear. I'll reveal." Her eyes widened. "Jonathan, there isn't time. Tell me." She swallowed, then whispered the secret she should never have spoken. And just like that, the cabin door sealed shut with a heavy, final click. The click of the cabin door echoed through Jonathan's chest like a verdict. A quiet finality settled over the plane, the kind that made even the recycled air feel heavier. Engines hummed beneath the floor, a low vibration threading up his spine. Passengers buckled in. Overhead, bins latched. A child laughed somewhere in the back, unaware of the storm forming in row 14. Elaine's whisper still clung to the air between them, fragile and poisonous all at once. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second, holding the words inside his mind like a shard of glass he dared not touch too quickly. They falsified safety audits. For years, entire regions of rail and air infrastructure signed off without inspections, and when two inspectors threatened to expose them, both died in accidents that weren't accidents. Your report was next, your findings. And now they think you're the only one left who can tie the threads together. His lungs tightened. The hum of the aircraft deepened as the pilot released the parking brake. Jonathan pressed a steady hand to his knee, grounding himself against the shifting weight of truth. There were pieces he had already suspected, irregularities in budget allocations, sealed testimonies, inexplicable delays in maintenance oversight. But this was rot all the way to the bone. Elaine's voice trembled again. They can't let you testify. If you make it to Washington, people go to prison, agencies collapse, and certain senators lose their careers. Jonathan opened his eyes. And you're just now telling me because you saw the men they sent. Elaine nodded regret, washing over her like a tide she couldn't outrun. I didn't want to believe it. But one of them, he was at my brother's memorial service, pretending to be a friend, pretending to care. Jonathan felt something cold settle into him. Not fear. Resolve. The kind that sharpened the mind rather than clouding it. Do you know their plan? He asked. Elaine shook her head. Not exactly, but they need plausible deniability. Something mechanical, something blamed on aging equipment or maintenance delays. Jonathan's gaze drifted down the aisle. His eyes landed on the first of the two men. The one near the emergency exit, early 40s, fit, too observant, too still. He tapped a single finger against the corner of his tray table, a code or a habit Jonathan couldn't tell. Then his gaze shifted forward to the second man, bulkier, a scar across his jaw. He kept scanning passengers, but his attention always returned to Jonathan, a flicker of impatience slipping through his mask. Jonathan's pulse measured the spacing between glances, patterned, coordinated. Not amateurs. Elaine leaned closer. You need to get off this plane. The engines rumbled deeper, the cabin dipping slightly as the aircraft began to taxi. Jonathan felt the forward motion, the sensation of the world narrowing toward a single runway, lined with lights like a countdown. Too late, he murmured. Elaine's breathing quickened. Jonathan, think. He tapped his fingers once on his briefcase. Not nerves, strategy. A silent rhythm marking the pieces he still had left to use. I need to reach the cockpit, he said under his breath. Elaine recoiled. That's impossible. They won't let a passenger, even you, just walk. He turned to her, the steel in his gaze cutting through her panic. They don't need to let me. I need them to question why I'm asking. Because questioning him meant checking him. Checking him meant calling someone. Calling someone meant alerting the wrong people or the right ones. Elaine's voice cracked. Jonathan, they might stop you, or worse, they might act now. He set his jaw. Then we make sure they don't see it coming. She stared at him, horrified and awed in equal measure. You sound like you've planned this before. He didn't answer. Some histories lived only in the tension of a man's shoulders. The plane turned sharply, aligning with the runway. The engine surged, heat rising through the cabin floor. Jonathan rose from his seat. The flight attendant gasped softly. Sir, please, sit down. We're about to take off. I need to speak to the captain. Jonathan said, his tone composed, but carrying an undertone that pressed the air itself into stillness. The attendant hesitated. Sir, that's not check my credentials, Jonathan said gently. She froze. Passengers looked up. The two men tensed simultaneously, like animals sensing a shift in the wind. Elaine gripped his wrist. Jonathan, don't! He eased his hand free. Trust me. The attendant swallowed and stepped back. One moment. She hurried toward the front, tapping urgently on her tablet as she moved her posture, stiffening with each step. The larger of the two men near the front rose quietly, pretending to fetch something from the overhead bin. His eyes locked on Jonathan with the slow, calculating assessment of someone deciding whether to strike now or wait for better cover. Jonathan felt the pressure build inside the cabin, air tightening, time thinning. Elaine tugged at his sleeve. "They think you're turning yourself in." "Good," he whispered. "Why?" "Because the moment they assume I'm surrendering, they'll hesitate. And while they hesitate, we breathe." The engines roared louder. The aircraft paused at the mouth of the runway. The flight attendant reappeared from the front galley, her face pale, her hands trembling as she approached. "Dr. Hale, the captain, would like a word with you immediately." A ripple pulsed through the cabin. Jonathan stepped into the aisle. The larger man moved an inch. Jonathan met his gaze, holding it long enough for the truth to land. "Not yet." The man froze, not out of fear, but confusion. And confusion, Jonathan knew, was a crack in any operation. Elaine watched, breathless. "Jonathan, what exactly are you planning?" Jonathan lifted his briefcase and spoke so softly she barely heard him. "Buying time." He began walking toward the cockpit. Each step sharpened the tension until the air felt tight enough to snap. At row 6, a hand brushed his sleeve, an elderly woman with cloudy eyes and trembling fingers. "Young man, you walk like someone carrying something heavy." Jonathan stopped. Her voice cut through the haze with surprising clarity. He placed a gentle hand over hers. "Ma'am, you have no idea." He moved on. He reached the front galley. The attendant stepped aside. The cockpit door opened slightly, just enough for a sliver of warm, amber light to spill onto the carpet. The captain's voice came through the gap. "Dr. Hale, come in." Jonathan stepped inside. Behind him, the cockpit door shut with a heavy final click, and the two men sent to stop him rose quietly from their seats. The cockpit door sealed behind Jonathan with a hollow thud that pressed the rest of the world into silence. The hush inside was different from the cabin's chaotic tension, denser, steadier humming, with the focused vigilance of a space where mistakes carried consequences measured in lives. The glow from the instrument panel washed over everything in muted shades of green and amber, flickering across the captain's sharp features as he turned in his seat. Captain Maurice Harland, mid-50s, square jaw, eyes that carried the weight of someone who had spent more nights in the sky than on solid ground. He studied Jonathan with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. Co-pilot Jenna Ruiz flicked a glance at Jonathan, but her hands stayed steady on the controls, guiding the aircraft toward takeoff position, as though nothing unusual was happening. Her voice, though, betrayed a tremor. "So we weren't expecting you. At all." Jonathan stepped forward, his briefcase held like a truth he could not afford to set down. "I imagine you weren't, and I apologize for the intrusion. But you need to know that this aircraft is not safe." Harland stiffened. "Unsafe, how?" "Not mechanically," Jonathan said. "Intentionally." Ruiz turned fully now, her fingers hovering above the throttle. "That's a serious statement." "So is the situation." Harland narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Jonathan hesitated only long enough to choose the version of the truth that would cause urgency without panic. "Two men on board are traveling under false identities. They intend to interfere with this flight. Their goal is to ensure I never arrive in Washington." Ruiz's breath caught. "And you're who exactly?" Jonathan opened his wallet, revealing the seal again. The cockpit lights bounced off its embossed surface like a quiet threat. Harland paled. "You're the chairman." He spoke the words without breath. "My God." Jonathan lowered the wallet. "I didn't intend for this to become public, but we are out of time. You need to keep the aircraft on the ground." Harland shook his head sharply. "We can't. Not without a verified threat. Tower won't authorize a hold based on a suspicion. We need specifics." Jonathan's jaw tightened. If you take off the men behind this operation, we'll act. I have documentation in this case that exposes corruption tied to national infrastructure safety. If I don't deliver it in person, the hearing will collapse, the cover-up will continue, and no one will be held accountable." Ruiz whispered, "Holy hell." Harland leaned back, hands clasped tightly. "You're telling me this isn't just about you. It's about the entire system." Jonathan held his gaze. It always has been. Harland's eyes darted to the closed cockpit door as though it might explode inward. "Those men, can you identify them? Row 7 aisle, row 3 bulkhead. Neither belongs on this flight." Ruiz swore under her breath. "And we're seconds from takeoff." Jonathan stepped closer. "Captain, if we leave the ground, they will not wait for a verified reason to act. They will create one." Harland's fingers drummed once on the armrest. The engines rumbled vibrations thrumming beneath their feet. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a pilot takes before choosing between two bad options. "All right. If we abort now, we need a protocol reason. Something that won't cause panic." Jonathan nodded. "Then give them one." Ruiz reached toward the radio. "Tower, this is Flight 74. We have a—" She glanced at Jonathan, searching for words. "Cockpit advisory irregularity. Requesting return to gate for manual inspection." Static crackled. "Say again, 74. Harland leaned into his mic. "Tower request immediate clearance to return to gate. Advisory panel fluctuation. Could be electrical." Jonathan felt a faint thud of dread. Could be electrical was aviation language, for this is serious but not catastrophic, just enough to force caution. The tower paused, a pause that stretched like a held breath. "Cleared to return. Taxi via Alpha 2. Harland cut the throttle. The engines eased the aircraft, slowing. Jonathan felt his knees weaken with relief, but only for a moment. Because behind the cockpit door there was movement. Sharp, purposeful. Ruiz heard it too. Someone's outside. Harland's eyes hardened. They know something's wrong. Jonathan's heart struck, once heavy. They would not wait. Not any more. The door trembled just barely as a weight leaned against it. Ruiz's hand slid toward the reinforced latch. "I locked it," she whispered. "But they're not supposed to be near the door, not unless they planned for this." Jonathan finished. Harland reached for the intercom. "Cabin crew, this is the flight deck. Secure the aisle. Do not allow anyone forward." A voice crackled back, shaky. "Understood, Captain. But someone's already." A muffled thump sounded through the speaker. Then silence. Ruiz's face drained of color. Harland shot to his feet, placing a hand on the door, as though feeling the pressure. "How many seconds do we have?" Jonathan's voice dropped to a murmur. "Less than you want." Ruiz's fingers trembled as she engaged deadbolts, manually locks rarely used outside emergencies. They clicked loudly. The men outside went still, listening. Jonathan stepped back, his pulse steady, even as adrenaline surged through him. He felt the shape of the briefcase's handle biting into his palm, grounding him in the moment. Harland whispered. "If they breach, they won't," Jonathan said. "Not yet." He moved to the far corner of the cockpit, the small space forcing him closer to the whirring instruments. He opened his briefcase just an inch enough to feel the cold edge of a steel cylinder hidden beneath documents. Elaine told him not to bring it, but he had spent his life preparing for hearings where truth was an endangered species. Some evidence needed more protection than paper could offer. A coded beacon. One touch. One signal. Harland's voice cut through his thoughts. "Doctor, Hale, what do they want you to do? Break, run, disappear? Jonathan shook his head slowly. No. They want me to vanish without a trace. They want plausible tragedy, a mechanical failure, a headline no one questions. A fist pounded against the cockpit door. Then another. Ruiz flinched. Harland braced a shoulder to the panel. The reinforced metal held for now. Jonathan closed his briefcase calmly. Captain, how long until we reach the gate? 3 minutes if they don't try something desperate. They will, Jonathan said. The pounding stalled. Silence thickened a silence more dangerous than noise. Ruiz whispered, "Why aren't they forcing it now?" Jonathan met her eyes. "Because they're waiting for the moment with the least witnesses." Her lips parted. "Takeoff, exactly." Harland's voice hardened. "We're returning to the gate. End of story." A voice seeped through the door. Low, controlled, chilling in its certainty. "Dr. Hale, you need to come out." Ruiz covered her mouth. Jonathan stepped closer. His voice matched theirs in calm precision. "That is not going to happen." A pause. Then the man spoke again. "You walk off this plane alive, the hearing will never happen. We will see to that. You know this." Jonathan's heartbeat didn't quicken. He spoke with the weight of a man who had faced senators' scandals and the quiet devastation of burying the only person who ever knew how deeply he feared failing. "You misunderstand," he said. "I'm not walking off this plane alive because I expect to survive you. I'm walking off this plane alive because you don't understand who else is watching." Ruiz's brows pulled tight. "Who else?" she whispered. Jonathan lifted his briefcase with both hands. The beacon inside pulsed once against his palm, ready. He looked at her, really looked, and in his voice there was grief, resolve, and something like apology. "Everyone." The pounding stopped so suddenly that the silence felt unnatural, like the air itself had flinched. Ruiz's breath trembled in the quiet. Harland stayed braced against the door muscles, coiled, waiting for the next impact. But none came. The men outside had gone still again, listening, calculating, adjusting their plan the way predators adjusted to the movements of their prey. Jonathan stood anchored in the corner of the cockpit, the briefcase held firmly in both hands. Every instinct inside him refined by years of interrogations, hearings, betrayals, and the quiet warfare of bureaucracy told him that stillness was not safety. Stillness meant strategy. It meant their adversaries were choosing a new angle, one they believed he would not anticipate. The radio crackled suddenly, a harsh burst of static. Then a soft tone that did not belong to the aircraft system. Ruiz jerked her head toward the panel. "That wasn't us." Harland's eyes sharpened. "They're trying to break into the comms." How Jonathan's voice was quiet. They prepared for this. Every detail, every contingency. They didn't come here hoping to kill me. They came expecting success. The radio crackled again. But this time, the voice came through clear male, low-controlled. "Flight 74, this is ground operations. You are instructed to continue taxi to runway 27 for immediate departure. Do not return to gate." Ruiz's blood ran cold. "That's not ground ops. That's not even the right channel." Harland reached for the mic, fury tightening his jaw. "Tower confirm last transmission." He froze mid-sentence. A light had blinked on the panel, a blinking he recognized. Jonathan stepped forward. "They're using a spoofed broadcast. If you answer, they'll trace the response and pin the interference on your cockpit. Then the narrative becomes pilot error." Ruiz pressed a hand to her forehead. "So they want to crash us and blame the crew." "And you?" Jonathan nodded once. Or force an emergency landing somewhere under their control. Anything that puts me in their custody before I reach Washington. Harland cursed under his breath. We're returning to that gate if I have to shut down both engines to do it. Jonathan looked through the windshield at the runway lights, stretching in rigid lines toward darkness. Snow drifted across them in thin, ghost-like threads. Captain, you need to know something. They won't let that happen. Harland gave a humorless laugh. He gestured toward the door. Whoever paid those men out there, whoever falsified safety audits, whoever collapses if I speak the truth. Ruiz's eyes widened. You're talking about the council itself. Jonathan didn't answer. His silence was confirmation enough. The cockpit door rattled, not from someone trying to force it, but from the shift of weight against it. A deliberate shift. Testing structural points, Harland's voice dropped. They're mapping the hinges. They won't get through, Jonathan said. Harland shot him a sharp look. You sound certain. I'm certain they don't want to break it unless they have to. The moment they force that door, they lose any narrative control. Ruiz swallowed. So what are they waiting for? Jonathan's fingertips pressed to the briefcase. An opportunity that looks organic. A quiet knock, 3 taps, evenly spaced, echoed against the door. Harland stiffened. Enough. Hale, sit down. Ruiz, call tower again, direct line. I don't care if they... The intercom crackled. Captain Harland, we need you to open the cockpit door. The voice belonged to a flight attendant, Mara. Soft-strained, trying to sound calm. Harland pressed the intercom. Mara, confirm identity phrase. Silence. Then, Captain, please. One of the passengers collapsed. We need help. Ruiz stiffened. That's not protocol. Jonathan inhaled slowly. It's bait. Harland raked a hand through his hair, torn between duty and survival. If someone is really down, Jonathan stepped closer. They know you're decent. They're exploiting it. They'll use the moment you unlatch that door. Even 2 inches is enough. Harland slammed a hand against the console. Damn it. Jonathan spoke softly, but with such gravity that Ruiz froze mid-breath. Captain, every emergency they create is designed to feel morally impossible to ignore, because hesitation is their weapon. Compassion is their breach point. The intercom clicked again. The same voice, smaller now. Captain, he's turning blue. Please, Ruiz's eyes filled with tears. They're using a woman's voice to know. Jonathan said. They're using a crisis no pilot can afford to dismiss. Harland pressed both palms to the edge of the door, forehead dipping toward the reinforced surface. His shoulders trembled with the weight of impossible choices. Jonathan moved to stand beside him. Captain, listen to me. If you open that door, none of us leave this aircraft alive. Harland let out a strangled breath. So what do we do? Jonathan straightened. We take control of the narrative before they do, Ruiz whispered. How Jonathan clicked open his briefcase. Inside lay documents. Yes, but beneath them sat a compact device the size of his palm, matte black, featureless, except for a recessed switch. Ruiz stared. Is that a federal emergency locator beacon? Jonathan said. Hardwired to bypass public channels, direct to Homeland Security and 2 congressional oversight committees. Harland gaped. You brought that onto a commercial aircraft. I bring it everywhere. The intercom clicked again, but this time a different voice emerged. Male. Low. Calm. Dr. Hale, you activate that device and everyone on this plane dies. Ruiz slapped a hand over her mouth. Harland felt the blood drain from his face. Jonathan looked at the door. His heartbeat didn't change. No, he said softly. If I activate it, everyone on this plane finally becomes visible. Silence. Thick. Absolute. Even the engines seemed to quiet. The voice replied almost gently. "Jonathan, don't do this." Jonathan closed his fingers around the beacon. He spoke with the steady conviction of a man who had lost too much to fear consequences anymore. "You've spent years hiding behind failures you engineered. People died because of your numbers, your shortcuts, your greed. And you expect me to stay silent because you threaten a plane full of people." A beat of breath. Slow. Measured. The man outside the door whispered, "They won't believe you." Jonathan's voice fell to a razor-thin edge. "They will when they hear what you did to those inspectors." A gasp sounded outside. Then chaos erupted. A shove slammed into the cockpit door. Ruiz screamed. Harland lunged to reinforce it. The entire panel shuddered under the impact. Jonathan flipped the switch. The beacon lit up like a small white star. Outside, someone shouted. Inside, Jonathan's eyes burned with the weight of a line crossed no return. No hesitation, only truth left ahead of him. Harland shouted over the pounding, "So what happens now?" Jonathan's answer came low, calm, devastating. Now they no longer get to decide who lives in the dark. The pounding against the cockpit door became a violent rhythm, each blow shaking the narrow metal frame, each strike coming faster, as if the men outside realized they had seconds before everything collapsed around them. Ruiz braced her shoulder against the latch, breath-sharp arms trembling. Harland planted both feet and leaned in, using his weight like a barricade. But Jonathan didn't turn toward the chaos. He watched the beacon in his hand, the small white pulse glowing steadily like a heartbeat. A different sound rose beneath the violence, distant at first, then swelling. Sirens, not police, not fire, not anything the average passenger had heard inside an airport. Homeland frequencies used only in emergencies that no one ever spoke about publicly. The beacon had triggered a silent avalanche. A man outside barked orders, sharp, panicked, no longer composed. Ruiz clutched the door harder. "They're trying to break it! They're really trying to break it!" Harland's voice strained. "They can't! Not before ground intervention gets here." Jonathan knew that was half a truth. Reinforced cockpit doors were strong, but everything had limits, especially when men were desperate, cornered, armed with tools no passenger should have been able to smuggle past security. The next blow dented the metal. Ruiz gasped. That wasn't a fist. A metallic scrape followed. Then another. The rhythmic screech of a tool biting into the hinge. Ruiz pressed her hands to her ears, horrified. "They have a breaching cutter." How did they get that on board? Jonathan exhaled slowly. Because someone wanted them to. Harland grunted, pushing back against another impact that nearly knocked him sideways. "They're accelerating. We've got maybe a minute." Jonathan stepped to the center of the cockpit. He placed the beacon carefully on the console, its light pulsing faster, as it transmitted non-stop distress-coded data passenger, manifest flight number, GPS coordinates, cockpit audio feed, and most damning Jonathan's identity. Not the public-facing role, the classified one. A signal that put every agency with clearance into immediate alert. Outside, the aircraft systems were already moving. Federal agents were racing across tarmac access roads. Fire response teams rerouted. Air traffic control scrambling to block outgoing communications from the gate area. But none of that mattered inside the sealed cabin, where metal shrieked and boots slammed against the door. Elaine's voice cracked through the intercom, small, terrified breaking. "Jonathan, they have something in the aisle. Something in a case." I think it's a deafening clang drowned her out. Ruiz shouted. They hit the second hinge. The cockpit door bowed inward, the reinforced metal deforming in a slow, agonizing curve. Harlan shoved with everything he had, sweat slicking his brow. "Hold it! Just hold!" Another sound cut him off. A thud not against the door but behind it. A body hitting the floor. A woman screamed from the cabin. Footsteps scrambled backward. Jonathan closed his eyes. They turned on her. Ruiz's voice shook violently. They took her. They took Elaine. Jonathan's stomach tightened, but he kept his posture still balanced. The men outside were no longer hiding their plan. They were detonating it. A voice roared from the other side of the door, deep, furious, unhinged. "Hale, stop the beacon! Now! Or we put her through this door in pieces." Ruiz flinched away from the threat, tears springing to her eyes. Harlan's jaw clenched so tight it trembled. Jonathan's face, however, remained unreadable stone, carved under the dim cockpit lights. Then came another voice. Elaine's. Muffled. Choked. "Jonathan, don't stop." Ruiz sobbed. "They're hurting her. They'll kill her." Jonathan's gaze lowered. Elaine Mercer was a woman who had lived a decade in fear, carrying guilt heavier than her own life. She had warned him, knowing it could cost her everything. She had been used as a pawn once. She refused to be used again. The man outside slammed something hard against the door, a threat punctuated by steel. "Hale, choose. Her life for your silence." Jonathan stepped closer to the door until his shadow fell across it. His voice came low, unwavering. "No." The next sound wasn't rage. It was disbelief. Then fury exploded. "You think you're untouchable? You think that beacon saves you?" Jonathan didn't blink. "It doesn't save me. It exposes you." The cutter screeched again, teeth biting deeper. The top hinge buckled. Harlan cursed, readjusting his stance. Ruiz pressed her full weight against the door, shaking violently under the strain. Jonathan lifted the mic to the intercom. "Elaine." A soft whimper answered. He closed his eyes. "I'm not stopping the beacon." Her breath hitched a sob wrapped in resolve. "Good." Then a cry. Pain. A man snarling for silence. The cutter grinding. The door bending inward another inch. Ruiz broke. "Please, sir, please, if they break through." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. Calm. It wasn't comfort. It was instruction, as though his touch alone redirected the chaos inside her chest. Harlan growled under the strain. "They're almost through. Hale, if you've got another trick now, would be the time." Jonathan exhaled. "There is one thing." He lifted his briefcase again. Ruiz stared at it, as though it might explode. "What is in there? Not what's in it." Jonathan said softly. "What it represents." He turned, opened the cockpit door's viewing port, a tiny slider window, used only in training simulations or catastrophic malfunctions. Harlan shouted, "No," but Jonathan had already moved. His fingers found the latch. He slid it open just half an inch enough for only his voice to pass through. Every sound in the cabin froze. Even the cutter stopped. Jonathan leaned in. His voice flowed out of the small opening like a blade dipped in frost. "Gentlemen, you should know something before you finish that door." A beat of silence. Then a second. Someone outside growled. "Speak then." Jonathan smiled barely. A ghost of something that was not humor, but inevitability. The moment this beacon activated, every flight recorder began streaming to federal archives. Every camera on this aircraft began transmitting off-site. Every word you speak is already preserved, even if you kill her, even if you kill everyone on board. You will not walk away unnoticed. Footsteps shuffled. A tense shift. Whispering. Jonathan continued, soft and lethal. "And if I die today, the evidence goes public within the hour. Not hidden, not sealed, not buried. Broadcast." The man outside spat. "You're bluffing." Jonathan's voice lowered colder than before. "I don't bluff, I expose." A moment of silence dragged out, vibrating with uncertainty. Ruiz squeezed her eyes shut, praying the men would falter. Then the cutter clattered to the floor. Harland blinked. Ruiz gasped. Someone outside barked a curse. Jonathan leaned closer to the opening. "You have one chance to stop this without adding murder to your list of failures." Another pause. Breathing. Whispered deliberation. Then a gunshot. Ruiz screamed, flinching, but the bullet hadn't hit the door. A body dropped. Elaine sobbed. Harland froze. "They're turning on each other." Jonathan closed the viewing slot. "They're unraveling." Desperation cracks loyalty. Ruiz pressed trembling fingers to her lips. "And what do we do now?" Jonathan stepped back, picked up the beacon, and tightened his grip. "We wait." Harland shook his head. For what Jonathan's eyes lifted toward the sealed door. For the moment when they realize the only way to survive is to surrender. Outside footsteps retreated. Inside, the engines hummed softly. Jonathan Hale steadied his breath. The truth he carried had finally become louder than the men trying to silence it. The footsteps outside the cockpit staggered into a frantic rhythm, the shuffle of men who had lost the script they were given. One barked an order, another snapped back. A third voice, strained, trembling, rose in protest, and was silenced with a sharp thud that made Ruiz recoil as if struck herself. The door vibrated with the aftershock, but no one tried to breach it again. Panic pulls people apart. Fear makes them sloppy, and Jonathan knew sloppiness was fatal to any covert operation. Harland finally sank into his seat chest, heaving. Ruiz clutched the edge of the console to steady her shaking hands. She whispered, "Do you think they killed one of their own?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He listened. The space beyond the door had changed. The air itself seemed to pulse with disarray. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying a heavier resonance. They didn't plan for this. The beacon forced them off the map. Now they're improvising. Ruiz wiped her eyes. "So that gunshot, it was a warning," Jonathan murmured, "or a punishment." Harland rubbed his forehead, frustration carved deep into the lines of his face. "We've got passengers back there. Children. If they panic and rush the cockpit—" "They won't," Jonathan said. "Not unless someone gives them a reason to. And right now the men outside are too busy arguing over who's still in control." As if summoned by the words, a shout rose from the cabin. Another. Then a string of curses. Ruiz flinched instinctively, reaching for the door. Jonathan caught her wrist, not harshly, but with enough pressure to anchor her. "No. Opening that door ends this flight in blood." She swallowed hard and nodded, even as her breath shook. Harland straightened. "If they're losing control, this might be our chance. If we call Tower again, declare a hijacking, they'll hear it," Jonathan cut in. "And if they feel the narrative slipping, they'll escalate before responders reach the jet bridge. We need them uncertain, not cornered." "You want them confused," Harland said slowly. "Confusion buys time." "Exactly." Another crash echoed from the cabin. Something metallic tumbled across the floor, bouncing, rolling, clattering. Sharp breaths followed. A woman cried out. Ruiz pressed a hand to her mouth. "They're threatening passengers now," she whispered. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the calm had transformed into something else. Resolve sharpened to a blade. They don't get what they came for. No leverage, no hostage bargaining. They thought secrecy was their shield. But secrecy is already gone. He lifted the beacon slightly. Its pale glow reflected off the cockpit windows, like a quiet star. Ruiz lowered her voice. "Sir, when you say everyone is watching, who do you mean Jonathan didn't look at her?" He looked straight ahead through the glass at the runway, bathed in dim winter light. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years fighting enemies no one ever saw, the kind of people who don't wait for permission to intervene. Harland blinked. That could mean anything, but Jonathan offered no more. Outside the cockpit, another scuffle erupted. A chair scraped violently. A grunt, bodies colliding. Then a voice cut through everything. Deep, commanding. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to dominate. "Everyone sit down." Now. Passengers froze. Even Ruiz felt her chest tighten. She whispered, "That's not one of them." Harland frowned. Then footsteps approached the cockpit. Slow, deliberate, not rushed like the attackers, not frantic like a hostage, a presence carried in each step. Jonathan felt something inside him settle. Recognition. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A knuckle tapped twice. Calm. Controlled. Harland shot Jonathan a panicked look. "We're not opening it!" Jonathan stepped forward before the captain could reach for the intercom. "Not yet. Let's hear him." The man outside spoke quietly, yet every syllable resonated with authority. "Dr. Hale, my name is Emerson Shaw. I'm a federal air marshal. I've been undercover in row 10 since boarding." Ruiz slapped a hand over her mouth. Harland sagged in his seat with relief. Jonathan remained still. Shaw continued. "I've identified 3 hostile actors. One is down. The other 2 are armed and unstable. I've secured passengers near the mid-cabin, but I cannot neutralize the situation without your cooperation." Harland pressed the mic. "Cooperate, sir, we can't open this door." "You shouldn't," Shaw said. "But there's something you can do from inside." Jonathan leaned in. "Go on." Shaw exhaled through his nose. "Hale, I'm assuming the beacon in your possession is active." Ruiz gasped. "How did he—" Jonathan's voice lowered. "You recognized the frequency." Shaw's tone hardened. "Everyone with clearance did. So listen carefully. External response teams are being held at perimeter checkpoints. Someone is blocking authorization to approach the aircraft." Jonathan's pulse tightened. "They're delaying federal response." "Yes, which means the only people coming to save this plane are inside this plane." Harland whispered a curse. Shaw continued. "I need you to disable cabin lighting." Ruiz blinked. "Disable lighting? Why, to force a hard reset of the electrical routing? When the system reboots, your beacon will piggyback on emergency frequency number 9, overriding the block. That pushes your transmission through every federal node simultaneously. Not even the Council can stop that." Jonathan's eyes sharpened. "And it alerts every off-site surveillance channel." "Exactly." Ruiz stared between them. "But if we cut lighting mid-taxi, passengers will panic." Jonathan shook his head. "Not if we do it fast. Panic lasts seconds. Truth lasts longer." Harland gripped the throttle lever. A complete power dip could require rechecks. "We'll be immobilized." "Good," Jonathan murmured. Immobilized planes are harder to sabotage quietly. A scream cut through the cabin. Then a male voice yelling for everyone to get down. Something crashed again. Shaw's voice darkened. "They're losing control. If the situation escalates further, they'll start injuring hostages to force access to you." Jonathan lifted his hand over the lighting switch panel. Ruiz grabbed his wrist. "Sir, if we do this, they'll know you're resisting." He met her eyes. "They already know." Her breath hitched. Jonathan looked to Harland. "Captain." Lights. Harland hesitated one final heartbeat of doubt before he nodded once. "Executing." His fingers flew across the console. The cockpit dimmed. A shudder ran through the plane. Then every cabin light went black. Darkness swallowed the aircraft. Passengers gasped. A child cried. A suitcase toppled. Bodies shifted. Breath trembled in the pitch-black cabin. The attackers cursed. Shaw whispered, "That did it." "Transmission is moving." Jonathan felt the beacon vibrate in his palm twice before locking into a steady glow. Ruiz whispered, "What now?" Jonathan's reply was quiet, but carried the weight of a man who knew the next seconds could determine the fate of everyone on board. Now they understand the plane is no longer theirs. A gunshot tore through the cabin. Ruiz screamed. Harland reached for the controls. Shaw yelled, "Everyone down!" And Jonathan Hale closed his fingers around the beacon, his expression unchanging as chaos erupted on the other side of the door. He had expected this moment. He had been preparing for it his entire life. The blast of the gunshot hung in the air long after the sound itself died, a ringing silence swallowing the cabin until only the staggered breathing of terrified passengers filled the darkness. Jonathan kept one hand braced on the console as Harland steadied the aircraft, trying to keep the taxiing jet centered, despite the chaos behind the reinforced door. Ruiz trembled fingers hovering over switches she prayed she would not need to use. A second thud echoed, not a shot this time, but the heavy collapse of a body against a seat. Shaw's voice cut through the dark with the precision of a man who had trained for moments like this. "Stay down. Everyone stay down." No sudden movement. The beacon in Jonathan's hand vibrated again, stronger, a steady pulse as the emergency override finally tore through the block on federal channels. Somewhere beyond the walls of the aircraft agencies that rarely coordinated were now converging toward a single point on the Denver tarmac. Jonathan felt the shift in the air even though the passengers couldn't see it. The world outside was waking up. Chaos surged behind the cockpit door. A man shouted. Another answered in a frantic growl. One of the attackers barked an order that cracked mid-sentence, fear rippling through the grit in his voice. Ruiz grabbed the captain's arm. "They're panicking. That's worse than control." Jonathan pressed a palm gently to her forearm, grounding her. When men like this panic, they reveal themselves. And when they reveal themselves, they collapse. Harland listened, jaw clenched tight, waiting for something, anything that resembled a signal he could act on. Then Shaw's voice rose again, louder now, commanding. "Weapon down! Now!" I won't say it again. A scuffle. Furniture scraped. A gasp. A hollow metallic clatter. "One weapon down," Ruiz whispered. "Not enough," Jonathan murmured. Then the plane jerked. Harland cursed under his breath as he fought the controls. What was that? The attackers had moved down the aisle too quickly, shifting the balance of the aircraft. Luggage spilled from overhead bins, thumping against seats. A woman cried out. A man shouted in fear. The cabin dissolved into a hurricane of noise. Jonathan stepped closer to the cockpit door. "Shaw, status." A pause. Then Shaw answered through labored breath. One hostile disarmed, one injured, one still active at the forward galley. He has the firearm. Harland exchanged a sharp look with Ruiz. "If he fires toward the bulkhead—" "He won't," Jonathan said. "You don't know that. I know he needs me alive. He has orders to retrieve me, not kill me." "That's only true until they lose control," Captain said. Jonathan didn't flinch. "They haven't lost it yet." Shaw shouted something muffled. Another thud, then the sharp crack of bone against plastic. Ruiz flinched again. Jonathan's voice steadied. "Shaw, what do you need from us?" Quiet Shaw hissed. "The man is close enough to hear." Jonathan recognized the change in tone. Shaw had shifted strategy. He wasn't trying to neutralize anymore. He was trying to stall, protect, preserve. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Then the cabin lights flashed back on. Passengers sobbed in relief, blinking into the sudden brightness. But Jonathan stiffened. That wasn't an accident. Someone had rewired the local breaker. And if the lights were back on, that meant the hostile in the galley was preparing to make the cabin visible, choosing targets, trying to regain psychological advantage. Ruiz whispered what they all feared. "He's going to take a hostage." Before Jonathan could respond, a chilling scream rose from the front of the cabin. A man's voice barked for silence. Then Jonathan Hale, "Get out here, now! Or she dies." Ruiz grabbed Jonathan's sleeve with shaking fingers. "No, you can't go out there." Harland shook his head fiercely. "He opens this door, it's over." Jonathan breathed in slow and deep, finding the center he always returned to when facing people who mistook cruelty for power. "I'm not opening the door," the attacker shouted again. Closer this time, the metal edge of his gun tapping the bulkhead. "Her life is on you, Hale." The intercom crackled. Shaw's voice was strained, almost guttural. Don't move. I'm working on it." Jonathan lifted the mic, but Harland grabbed his wrist. "Don't antagonize him. I'm not." He pressed the button. "I'm not coming out. And if you kill her, the world will know exactly why." A dangerous silence expanded. Ruiz swallowed, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Captain Harland braced his shoulder against the cockpit door again, though he knew it wouldn't help. Jonathan set the mic down gently, knowing what would follow. A sound rose in the cabin, deep, harsh, desperate. Not triumph. Not command. Panic. Then a shout from shore. Move a crash. A gun discharge. A scream. Two bodies collided with the wall so hard the cockpit vibrated. Ruiz covered her ears. Harland ducked instinctively. Jonathan didn't blink. Shaw shouted again. "I have him! I have—" The sound strangled into a grunt, as though someone had locked an arm around his throat. Jonathan stepped forward, instinct gripping him. Shaw. Another muffled roar, then a sickening thud. The plane fell quiet again. "Too quiet," Ruiz whispered. "Is he?" Jonathan closed his eyes. No. Shaw was not the type to fall easily. Then metal scraped, heavy breathing, a body dragged across carpet, a voice, weak but alive, pushed through. "Hale, he's down." Jonathan exhaled the breath he'd been holding. Passengers sobbed in relief. A baby cried. Someone applauded, shakily. Harland's head fell forward, shoulders sagging. Ruiz clutched the console with both hands, trembling. Then pounding, erupted not from inside, from outside. Federal responders, real ones. "Get that door open. Now." Harland sprang into motion, releasing the locks. The cockpit door swung inward, and the cold burst of the jet bridge rushed in with armed agents in tactical gear, flooding the aircraft. Jonathan stepped aside as they surged down the aisle, securing the cabin, tending to the wounded, protecting the innocent. He moved like a man who had seen this unfold before, not surprised but solemn, carrying the grief of understanding what corruption demanded from those brave enough to confront it. Elaine stumbled toward him from the cabin, shaken, bruised, alive. Jonathan steadied her with a gentle touch. "You held on," he said quietly. She nodded, swallowing hard. You gave me something worth holding for. Agents surrounded Jonathan, not to restrain him, but to shield him, escort him, preserve his testimony, preserve the truth. Captain Harland shook Jonathan's hand, voice thick with emotion. You saved more lives than you know. Ruiz nodded fiercely, eyes shining. And you changed mine. Jonathan offered a tired, sad smile. Then let's make sure today changes more than that. He stepped into the jet bridge beacon, still glowing faintly in his hand. He had survived. But survival meant responsibility. Responsibility meant truth. And truth, once released, never returned quietly to the dark. If you want more stories that blend courage, truth, and the human heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. 3 words: justice, truth, courage.